The day after the election, at a gathering for white men in Wilmington, the Democrats unveiled a document called the White Declaration of Independence. It contained an ultimatum. Cynthia Brown, whose descendants were in Wilmington back in 1898, is a historian at her church where there's a preserved copy of the Declaration from the next day's newspaper.
We will no longer be ruled and will never again be ruled by men of African origin. We will no longer be ruled and will never again be ruled by men of African origin.
So you heard what the lady just read. She said that the whites were saying that they were no longer going to be under the rule of so-called blacks or Negroes. Okay? So that's letting you know that blacks had rulership, predominant role in society. That's why they had to miseducate and teach so-called black African Americans the wrong side of history, basically off of narratives and lies. So you're taught to believe that you're nothing but a slave, you have no contributions to society, and that you come from just slavery, nothing else. That's why they had to whitewash certain pictures, and they had to teach history on the left-hand side. Everything is backwards. And even in their books, they lie.
Over the years, the textbooks on North Carolina's history have struggled to accurately describe what happened in 1898. This one from 1933 says the situation was unfortunate for both races. And this one from 1978 doesn't have that much more detail. But they both praise Charles Aycock, a politician who helped perpetrate the riot. They say he had a keen mind and a kind heart, and that, in fact, he was one of the best friends that the colored people had in the state.
It's a legacy that North Carolina has yet to fully undo. The names of the perpetrators are on Wilmington's school buildings and city parks. But the legacy is also bigger than those names.
So you got to figure out what is true and what can you compare. You know, you got to look at all this stuff. If they lied about something simple as this, what else is they lied about? You cannot take a lot of their sources credible. Sometimes you can, but I mean, they're gonna sit there and lie about history because history goes to the winners. And you see how the papers, you know, portrayed the Negroes as monsters, beasts, and then, you know, the same old hook, line, and sinker, the old white woman, you know, the Negroes after the white women. So there you go.
Local cartoon of the type that ran. You may not be able to read it, but you know exactly what it means.
Many of the cartoons were centered on the threat of Negro rule. And the threat of Negro rule. Even though the fusion government was mostly white, they also played up another fear.
Black men threatening white women became a theme.
It happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma, in June of 1921. For decades, city officials covered it up. The history books barely mentioned it, and people, white people that is, hardly ever talked about Tulsa burning. But all that's changing now. The state commission has begun investigating the riot and is already raising tough questions about what today's citizens owe yesterday's victims. And it's revived memories for George Monroe of a night 78 years ago when his mother saw 4 white men walking up to their house carrying torches. Monroe escaped with some sore fingers. His home and the rest of Tulsa's black neighborhood, called Greenwood, was burning. Before the riot, 10,000 blacks lived in Greenwood, did business there, prospered there. In fact, Greenwood was one of the nation's most vibrant black communities, but children quickly learned that they lived in a different world from whites.
The tracks was a dividing line.
How old were you when you heard about the riot of 1921?
I was 15 and in high school.
You hadn't heard about it until you were 15.
didn't believe it.
What Ross heard then is that on the morning of May 30th, a young black man got into the elevator of a building downtown, and that the elevator operator, a 17-year-old white girl, screamed.
Nabbed Negro for attacking girl. Within the next hour, there's lynch talk on the streets of Tulsa.
Historian Scott Ellsworth has been studying the Tulsa riot for 20 years. It's not just an academic quest for Ellsworth. He was born and raised in Tulsa.
So the word of a lynching was out in the streets. Whites started gathering. How were blacks reacting? Great concern. I mean, everybody knew what was about to happen.
Many of Tulsa's blacks were veterans of the First World War and armed. A group went to the courthouse and offered to help defend the jail and its black prisoner. The sheriff told them to go home.
And as they're leaving, a white man goes up to a tall black vet and says, "Where you going with that gun, nigger?" And the vet says, "I'm going to use it if I have to." The white man says, "Like hell you are, give it to me." A struggle. Shot goes off. The worst riot in American history begins.
Alone, over 80% of all the black men in the former Confederate states registered to vote. 3 years later, Hiram Revels was elected the first black man to serve in the United States Senate, and Joseph Rainey became the first black United States congressman. Their election paved the way for more than 2,000 black office holders who served at every level of government during Reconstruction.
There are not many moments in recorded human history where a group that was so subordinated would, within the space of a decade, actually be integrated into the highest echelons of political society.
But the momentum wouldn't last. Black men's access to the ballot box, along with other key rights gained during Reconstruction, were rolled back systematically throughout the South. In 1875, near the end of Reconstruction, the 44th Congress included 7 black House members and a United States Senator. By 1900, only 1 remained, Congressman George Henry White of North Carolina.
By the time George H. White leaves office in 1901, he literally turns the light off on national black political leadership. No one will come behind him for an entire generation.
One of the cruel ironies of Reconstruction is that black people could claim certain rights in the 1870s that they would have to fight to reclaim in the 1960s. A sobering reminder that achievements thought permanent can be overturned and rights can never be taken for granted.
Black voters, Republican voters, had been thoroughly intimidated here.
By all accounts, the elections of 1898 were a sham. The Democratic Party had a paramilitary group called the Red Shirts. They attacked and blocked black residents from voting. At a rally just before the election, Alfred Moore Waddell provoked the crowds. He said, "Negro office holding ought at once and forever be brought to an end, even if we have to choke the current of the Cape Fear River with carcasses." The votes were counted and the Democrats won.
Democratic candidates won every seat they had a candidate up for election in.
But some local fusionist politicians remained in power because their seats hadn't been up for re-election, like the white Republican mayor and the Board of Aldermen. And of course, the election did nothing to undo the economic power black folks held in the city. The Democrats had won the election, but their goal of total white supremacist control remained out of reach.
And so they engineered what was essentially a coup d'etat.
They would strip black men of voting rights. They would give white men a large part of the employment heretofore given to black men. And as for Alex Manly, we demand that he leave this city forever within 24 hours. The next morning, hundreds of white men marched to the offices of the Daily Record. Manly was gone. He had fled to save his own life. They set the Daily Record building on fire. This is where it once stood.
Once the white leadership destroyed Alex Manly's printing press, they destroyed one way in which the African American community in Wilmington could organize itself and keep itself informed.
At City Hall, the mayor and board of aldermen were forced out.
There's 200 armed men in City Hall at the time. They didn't do it of their own free will. And as they resigned, a new member selected by the Democratic Party was voted into office.
Waddell, who once threatened to fill the Cape Fear River with black bodies, was the new mayor of Wilmington. Meanwhile, the mob had grown to about 2,000 men, and the violence spilled into the streets. In these photos, X's mark where the first black residents were killed. Shortly afterward, Democrats printed booklets celebrating a glorious victory, and in the newspapers depicted black residents as the instigators.
This image is a gross misrepresentation of what actually happened during 1898. You know, what you see is African American men with guns, not white men with machine guns.
The city never regained its black majority population. Jim Crow laws like literacy tests and poll taxes that prevented black people from voting were immediately enacted, and Wilmington's spirit of black opportunity was crushed. Black political representation in the state was over. It would be 90 years until North Carolina elected its next black Congress member.
Wilmington did a really great job of covering up a very dark past for a very long time.
My thoughts. Well, my thoughts are, as the presentation stated, the Reconstruction, you see blacks were doing well while they was on their own. And even the blacks and the whites, at the time in the 1800s, they got along, at one period of time. But it's when that status and politics and, those racist bigots got in the ear of politicians and the people, that's when everything started to go down the hill. But it was the heathens, so-called whites, that came, lied, and burnt down their cities, their economic structure. There's nothing new under the sun. That's why they don't want blacks coming together. That's why, and that's history for you. That's not separatist. That's not, whatever you want to call it. That's just pro-truth. It's history. That the government secretly, deliberately destroyed black cities in America. Just like they do overseas in the army. They infiltrate these different countries. There's no difference. Okay? So when the older generation says, oh, my ancestors, yeah, your ancestors in the 1900s couldn't vote because of racial discrimination. But during the Reconstruction period, blacks had senators, people in the seats. Just like in Deuteronomy, where it says, a king one of your own brethren shall reign over you. That's why, what's the purpose of voting? Because there's no one in the Congress. Now, I'm not talking about no president. Trump's just a puppet. All those presidents are puppet. There's no one to represent so-called blacks in the Senate. That's why all these shootings keep going on and everything else. There's no one to represent us. We're nationless. That's why they can kill a black man, get away with it, and there's nothing new under the sun. It just keeps happening. They do what they want to do. Also, other different communities, they don't even vote. Why do they need the so-called black vote? Because black is gold, like black gold. It generates revenue. We're the only nation of people that spend money on different nationalities of people's hair, weave. We go to the other nations. We don't have our own. That's what they're terrified of. So you going to the polls and voting for what? There's still going to be another brother being shot in the head, killed and everything else. So what does the vote actually mean when you have no one to represent you? And then you got your boule Negroes. They sold out. I mean, it is what it is. You know, they getting Reverend Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton. You know, those are just puppets. They have no power. They can't change anything. It's strength in numbers. It's like during the Reconstruction period, like on my father's side, his mother, the Brown estate, they own hundreds of acres of land. Why is that? Because we had people in the Senate, the office. And it's just like today, you voting for what? There's no one like you or your brethren to represent you. We're nationless. And that goes by using that word black, because black is not a race. But signing out, peace and shalom. Oh yeah, one more thing. And another reason why they didn't want the Black Wall Street or Tulsa, or even in the the mid to late 1800s, for blacks to succeed, because they could create their own economic wealth. See, that's the thing most people don't understand. Everything in this system based on monetary gain. The court systems, divorce rates, your children, they're not yours. They're a part of the system, the state. They're the states. You can't even whoop your child, because you whoop your child, they're going to send you to jail, or, do whatever they want to do. That's why in Boys in the Hood, Furious was like, we need to be like the Jews, because the Jews own the banks, at least the elite ones. They own the money system, the central banks. That's why they can pay themselves. One more thing to add is, with the blacks, so-called blacks, creating their own economic system, that will come against the Rothschilds, because the Jews own the central banks, the Federal Reserves. So they control the people. That's how you have all these banks, and they control it. It's subsidized through the European sovereign, just like the wars with Napoleon. So they own the banks. It's money system. That's why they had to destroy the Black Tulsa Wall Street and get rid of the people in the Reconstruction Era towards the end. Okay, blacks flourishing and having their own economic system. That's not gonna fly. Nope. Look at the music industry. Like with look at all these you got all these rappers, but they're always signed or independent, but they can't come together and start their own, major, super label. They can't do that, because the Jews will shut them down. They know who the master is. The Jews own that industry as well, because it's their economic system, believe it or not. That's why if you look on the news, media, they always portray so-called blacks in a negative light. And that's why you got a lot of these low-level people who only look at blacks as inferior, or look at them as, good for nothings, because they only see the negative stereotypes portrayed on television. A picture's worth 1,000 words. Most people don't read. Okay, but you'll never hear nothing bad about so-called ish on television. And if you do hear something like that football player, Deshaun Jackson and Nick Cannon, they got punished. They was in timeout, because their handlers, or their masters, whatever you want to call them, they put them in timeout. They put them in their place, and now you hear nothing about it no more. That's power.